some front end servicing on my first gen Nissan Xterra here. Specifically, I'm going to be tackling the wheel bearings and making sure that they're packed with fresh grease, but along the way I'm going to be doing some other miscellaneous cleaning, greasing, and inspecting. So go ahead and lift your vehicle and remove the front tire. So if you have a manual locking hub, I recommend going ahead and removing this outer cap with a small Allen wrench. This just makes it easier to get to the main hub hardware. So once the cap is out of the way, then you can get a socket with an extension and use a 6mm Allen wrench. Makes it easier to torque and break loose this hardware. So with all of the hardware out, the hub should be able to slide off. These worn manually locking hubs actually have an O-ring seal to the inner bore of the hub, so it looks like it's stuck pretty good. So I'm just going to use a pry bar and try and press it away. So with the hub removed, you can see the axle sticking out, and there's going to be a snap ring that you need to remove first. Snap ring removed. Next, there is a disc. It's got a bunch of holes in it, and there's actually going to be 2 Phillips head screws. These screws don't have a whole lot of torque, but it is a soft screw, so you want to make sure that you use a lot of down pressure on your screwdriver so you don't strip it out. So there's another screw underneath the axle on mine. The orientation might be different on yours. So once you have those screws out, take a small punch and you just want to pull this ring out. This ring has 2 little tabs that stick out, and it engages with some notches. These notches are actually cut into the spindle. So the spindle is what the entire hub and bearing rotates on. And this ring just screws into the actual lock nut, and it just holds it on and prevents it from backing out or loosening up. So underneath that ring is the lock nut, and it looks like it's another ring with a bunch of holes in it, but you need to loosen it up. It just threads onto some threads that are cut into the actual spindle that the bearings rotate on. So you can use a hammer and punch on the inside of the non-threaded holes. But I also have a specialty socket that has 2 little tabs that line up with the holes perfectly. And you can use a wrench if you need, but mine is loose enough by hand now that I've tapped it free. Lock nut is free, and now we are at the outer wheel bearing. Now, before you remove the whole hub, you're going to have to get your brake pads and your brake caliper off. So there's 2 pieces of hardware on the back that you're going to want to break loose. You could have removed the brakes first before you dug into the hub this far, but it doesn't really matter. So there's 1 bolt on the top, and there's going to be 1 bolt on the bottom. Now that those 2 bolts are out, you can use a pry bar, and you just want to pry this outer caliper off. And now you want to set it out of the way. I usually just sit it on top of the upper control arm like that. So you can now pop out your brake pads, take a look at them, clean them, re-grease them. I've still got some decent life on those. Alright, so you still have this bracket that's going over the rotor, which is going to prevent you from sliding the hub off. But what you can do is to go ahead and undo the bolts that are holding the hub to the rotor. That'll allow you to separate. With those bolts out, you can slide a pry bar in between the hub and the rotor and just spin it so you can pry it off evenly. Now you have the hub and both bearings. And the rotor can come free just like that. So this is your outer wheel bearing. And on the back side of the wheel hub, there is a rubber seal that presses in there, and there's going to be a wheel bearing on the back side. You can see these little teeth right here. These are actual pickups for the ABS sensor. So you want to take a wire brush to these, clean them up, spray them with some brake cleaner. So for repacking bearings, I've got a device right here that's a bearing packer. It's just a cup of grease. It has a handle on it. The handle unscrews. And the bottom of the handle has a taper. And that taper is going to be able to fit in the bearing like that and create a seal. So if you look through here, this is basically a piston and the cup is acting as a cylinder. You can see a couple dots of clean grease coming out. And that's because there's a couple holes that are cut through this sealing piston. So what you do is you take your wheel bearing and you set your wheel bearing in the bottom of the cup. You're then going to push the handle back on top. So now the piston is sealing to the bottom of the bearing. The taper on this handle is sealing to the top side of the bearing, and you're going to press down. And you're actually using hydraulic pressure to force fresh grease from the bottom chamber in the cup up through the center of the bearing and then out through the edges. And just like that, you can see black grease, which is the bad grease, and you can see the fresh green grease coming through. And now you have a packed bearing. There's other ways to pack a bearing. You can pack them by hand. It's a little bit more messy. Definitely recommend rubber gloves. But there's other options if you don't want to purchase a special bearing packing tool, although I find this is a lot easier and faster. So if you look inside the hub, it's hard to see with the grease that I have in here. But this is the bearing race. This is actually an outer ring, and that's what the actual rollers on the bearings actually ride against. This is actually just a piece that's pressed in. If you needed to replace your entire bearing or your race, what you would need to do is flip the hub over, and it's hard to see from this video angle, but there's a couple windows or notches where you can see the back edge of that bearing race, and there's going to be one window on one side and then one on the other side completely opposite. This allows you to get a punch in there, and then you can alternate sides with the hammer and punch, and that'll slide the race out. To seat a new bearing race in, you can get a bearing race tool from AutoZone. You can rent it and then return it and then get your money back. That is just a punch that has the proper taper to actually match with the bearing race and allows you to drive the new race in nice and square. So I'm going to set this freshly packed bearing aside because now I need to remove the seal on the back side and repack the inner bearing. This is a rubber seal. It just pops out, but you want to make sure that you don't damage the seal because this seals along the back edge and prevents water ingress into your bearings. And now I have my inner bearing. The inner bearing will also have a bearing race that is pressed in, and if you need to replace this one, the same logic applies. You just flip it over and look for the window where you can drive a punch on the back side of the bearing and alternate sides to drive it out evenly. So now you can see how the grease gets pressed through the bearings. Once you see good fresh grease on the back side coming out, that's how you know all the bad grease is out. Take a hammer you don't mind getting greasy. And now you're just reassembling the hub. Spread some grease on the races, put your inner bearing back on, and reassemble the reverse of how you took it apart. Reassembly does require a little bit of finesse to get everything seated properly, but the bolts here, when you reassemble them, you want to make sure that you start with opposite sides so that way it presses the hub evenly onto the rotor, and then you want to do a star pattern to do the final tightening. You want to make sure that this outer bearing does get seated square on the spindle, because if it does go on kind of crooked, it'll get bound up and it won't be able to sit deep enough to get the threaded locking ring on. And this is really where the special socket comes into play and helps out quite a bit, because this allows you to apply a bit more torque than a hammer and punch, and you can make sure that it gets seated properly and kind of tighten it down. So there's actually a very specific tightening sequence in the factory service manual. But it's basically that you apply some amount of torque, and then you back it off, and then you apply a very small amount of torque. So you're not sandwiching these bearings super tight, but you do want to do an initial tightening that's a bit tighter than you would normally leave it at, because you want to make sure that everything's kind of compressed and seated in the races properly. Aside from that, you've got this locking ring. And the locking ring has those 2 tabs, and there's 4 different notches that it could possibly mate with, and you can also set the locking ring this way or this way. And so you got to make sure that some of the holes here line up with the threaded holes on the ring. So you might have to loosen this lock nut or tighten it a little bit to make sure that you can find the holes that line up. Alright, so I think I might have gotten this first try. It looks like this one and the one directly underneath are going to sit properly, but let's see if I can get those small screws started. So you want to get both of the screws started into the threads before you tighten either of them down, because you might need to wiggle that ring back and forth to get both screws lined up. And again, you don't want to make these super tight because you don't want to strip out the Phillips feature on the actual screw. I've got one that's already starting to strip out. So I got to use a lot of downforce on the screwdriver, and you just want to snug it up. So before you assemble everything else, you just want to make sure that it rotates smooth and true. You don't want to see a wobble if you look at it from overhead. And then you just want to make sure that if you grab it on opposite sides of the rotors, that it's not loose and you have no axial play in and out. So everything looks good on this. I do have thick grease in there, so it's not going to, free spin forever. It should take a little bit of effort. So now you just need to put the snap ring back on, put your locking hub back on, and then we're going to clean up everything. So your hub's all back together, and now that you have the locking hub on, and that's going to prevent any brake cleaner from getting inside the bearings, you're going to need to get all of this grease off of the rotor that you just had your grimy, greasy hands all over. Use eye protection because this stuff is pressurized, and if it hits something and bounces back into your eyes, it stings like crazy. Use a paper towel and clean up any grease that's left behind that's easy to get to. So I do got brake pads here, and I'm going to go ahead and just spray these with brake cleaner, clean off all of the buildup on the back, and also on the braking surface I'm just going to completely soak it. A wire brush helps get all the dirt, grime, and buildup out of the way. If you forget which pad went where, you can look for the indentation of what is holding it in place. So this has 2 tabs kind of holding it, and just match it up with the caliper. So the 2 tabs, that looks like those 2 tabs are actually where it was exposed. So it's actually 3 tabs. So this is going to be on the outside. So I will take a small dab of grease and just apply it to the backing of the pads. That's where there's going to be that metal on metal wear or friction. And that can cause squeaking, rattling, and grinding noises coming from the brakes. And now I'm just going to slide the caliper back in place over these pads. And go ahead and tighten down the hardware for your upper caliper to your lower caliper bracket. Some other things you can go ahead and grease if you got a grease gun: upper ball joint if you've got the lift upper control arms. So you want to spray that with brake cleaner, hit it with the wire brush to make sure that the grease zerk is free. Same thing with the upper control arm mounts. These are actually probably dirty enough that I should probably disassemble them and clean them and grease the entire thing fresh from the disassembled state. A flex hose makes it a lot easier if you want to do this type of servicing with the tire still on. So same thing for upper control arm mounts. I'm just going to grease them like this for now. I might take them apart a little bit later. But you're going to pump them full of grease, and you're going to look out the edges to where you'll see that dirty grease coming out. And that's how you know you got clean grease in there. If you've got Moog brand tie rod ends that have a grease zerk, go ahead and give those some grease too. These are a little bit more difficult to get to when you have the rim on. Now this tie rod end is really torn with the rubber. This is a Duralast tie rod end. That's because I have this Grassroots center link, and so I actually don't have a lot of clearance with this part of the frame here. So this has a smaller body compared to the greasable Moogs. There's no room for a grease zerk down there. So I got my high lift jack back up underneath the rock slider. I got my other jack underneath the spring perch on the leaf springs on the rear tire. I'm going to go ahead and rotate my tires from front to back.